A chance encounter. Officer Daniel Rhodes drove slowly down the dimly lit streets of the quiet suburban neighborhood, his police cruiser moving at a deliberate pace. The streetlights flickered occasionally, their amber glow reflecting off the wet asphalt from an earlier drizzle. This neighborhood, usually tranquil, had an air of unease tonight. Daniel had patrolled these streets for years, and his gut told him when something was off. As he rounded a corner, something unusual caught his eye. A lone figure sitting on the curb beneath a flickering streetlight. It was a child, a boy, no older than 8 or 9. His small frame hunched over as though he were shielding himself from the world. His arms clutched something tightly to his chest, and even from the distance, Daniel could tell the boy was crying. He pulled over to the curb, the flashing blue and red lights casting eerie shadows over the houses. Parking his cruiser at a respectful distance, Daniel stepped out cautiously. His boots clicked softly on the wet pavement as he approached, his years of experience teaching him the importance of non-threatening body language in moments like these. "Hey there, buddy," Daniel called out gently, his voice warm but professional. "It's a bit late to be out all alone. Are you okay?" The boy's head jerked up at the sound of his voice. His dark eyes, glistening with tears, met Daniel's for a brief moment before darting away. His grip on the object in his arms tightened, and he shrank further into himself. The boy didn't say a word. Daniel crouched to his level, keeping a safe distance to avoid overwhelming him. The boy was young, his face round with baby fat, but his eyes held an exhaustion far beyond his years. His clothes were slightly oversized and rumpled, and his sneakers had seen better days. Whatever he'd been through, it was clear he'd been on his own for some time. "My name's Daniel. I'm a police officer, but you can just call me Daniel," he said, his tone kind but steady. "I'm here to help you, not to get you in trouble. Can you tell me your name?" The boy didn't respond immediately. His lips trembled as though he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Finally, in a voice so soft Daniel had to lean closer to hear, he mumbled, "Mason." "Mason. That's a strong name," Daniel said, smiling reassuringly. "It's nice to meet you, Mason. Can you tell me what's got you out here so late? Are you lost?" The boy shook his head, but didn't elaborate. Daniel's eyes drifted to the item Mason held so protectively against his chest. It was a photograph, its edges worn and creased from frequent handling. "Is that a picture you've got there?" Daniel asked gently. "It looks really important to you." Mason stiffened, pulling the photo closer to his chest. "It's all I have left," he whispered, his voice breaking. Daniel's heart tightened. He wanted to press further, to understand what Mason meant, but he knew better than to rush the boy. Trust took time. "You must be cold out here," Daniel said instead, standing and offering his hand. "How about we go sit somewhere warm and safe? There's a diner not too far from here. We can get some hot chocolate and figure things out. What do you say?" Mason hesitated, his wide eyes scanning Daniel's face for any sign of deception. Finally, he reached out with a trembling hand and took Daniel's. His grip was weak, his fingers ice-cold against Daniel's palm. The boy was clearly exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Daniel led him to the cruiser and opened the passenger door. "You can sit up front," he said, trying to make the situation less intimidating. Mason climbed in, still clutching the photo, and stared straight ahead as Daniel started the car. The drive to the diner was silent except for the low hum of the engine. Daniel glanced at Mason occasionally, his mind racing with questions. Who was this boy? Why was he out here alone? And what was the story behind that photograph? At the diner, the warm scent of coffee and baked goods greeted them as they stepped inside. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, greeted Daniel with familiarity. "Evening, Officer Rhodes." "Late night?" she asked before noticing Mason. Her smile softened. "And who's this little guy?" "This is Mason," Daniel said. "He could use some hot chocolate if you've got it." "Coming right up," she said, her eyes lingering on Mason with a mix of curiosity and concern. Daniel guided Mason to a booth near the back, away from the few other patrons. The boy slid into the seat, keeping his head down and the photo in his lap. "Do you want to talk about what's going on, Mason?" Daniel asked once they were seated. "You don't have to tell me everything right now, but I want to help." Mason shook his head. "You can't help," he murmured. "Nobody can." The waitress returned with a steaming mug of hot chocolate, topped with whipped cream and sprinkles. She placed it in front of Mason, giving him an encouraging smile before walking away. Daniel watched as Mason stared at the mud for a moment before taking a tentative sip. The warmth seemed to bring a faint trace of color back to his cheeks. "That's good, isn't it?" Daniel said with a small smile. "Mrs. Brown makes the best hot chocolate in town." Mason didn't respond, but he took another sip, his grip on the photo loosening slightly. Daniel decided to try a different approach. "Is that picture of your family?" he asked gently. "They must be very special to you." Mason's eyes filled with tears, and he nodded. "It's my mom and dad," he said, his voice trembling. Before he trailed off, and Daniel's heart broke at the raw pain in the boy's voice. Whatever had happened to Mason's family had left a wound that was far from healed. "I'm so sorry, Mason," Daniel said softly. "I can't imagine how hard this must be for you, but you're not alone now. Okay, we're going to figure this out together." Mason looked up at him for the first time, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. "You promise?" he asked. "I promise," Daniel said firmly. For the first time that night, Mason relaxed slightly. He took another sip of his hot chocolate, the warmth spreading through his small frame. As the tension in his shoulders eased, Daniel felt a renewed determination to uncover the truth behind this boy's pain. But as he watched Mason clutch that photo with such desperation, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that whatever story it held was going to change everything. The photograph's secrets. The next morning, Officer Daniel Rhodes sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee, the rich aroma doing little to clear the heaviness in his chest. Across from him, Mason sat in silence, still clutching the photograph he had refused to let go of the night before. The boy's eyes were bloodshot, his small face set in a mixture of sadness and fear. Whatever burden he carried, it was far too heavy for someone his age. Daniel's home was modest but warm. The walls were lined with framed pictures of his family, his police academy graduation, and his young daughter who had passed away years ago. He caught Mason glancing at those photos every now and then, his expression unreadable. "Did you sleep okay?" Daniel asked gently, breaking the silence. Mason shrugged. He had spent the night in the guest room, but Daniel had heard him tossing and turning. A few times, the faint sound of muffled cries had reached his ears. "You're safe here," Daniel said, trying to reassure him. "You don't have to be afraid." Mason finally looked up, his small hands fidgeting with the edges of the photograph. Daniel noticed how worn it was, creased from constant handling, as though Mason had been clutching it for weeks, maybe months. "Can I see the picture?" Daniel asked softly. Mason hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edges. For a moment, Daniel thought he would refuse again, but slowly, reluctantly, Mason slid the photo across the table. Daniel picked it up with care, as though handling something fragile. The image was of a smiling couple, a man and a woman, standing in front of an old brick building. The man was tall with broad shoulders, his arm wrapped protectively around the woman's waist. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile, her hair cascading over her shoulders. Mason was between them, a wide grin on his face as he held both their hands. "This is your family?" Daniel asked, glancing at Mason. Mason nodded, his lips trembling. "Before the accident." Daniel's stomach sank. "What kind of accident, Mason? What happened?" Mason stared down at his lap, his small fists clenched. "A car crash," he whispered. "We were on our way to the park. It was my birthday." Daniel's breath caught. He'd been a cop for long enough to recognize when someone was reliving a memory too painful to express. Mason's face told the story. The loss, the guilt, the helplessness. "I'm so sorry," Daniel said sincerely. "That must have been so hard for you." Mason nodded but didn't speak. Daniel studied the photograph again, something catching his eye. Behind the smiling family, faint but visible, was the reflection of a car's grille in a window of the brick building. It was sleek, shiny, a luxury car, not something you'd see in Mason's modest neighborhood. "Do you remember anything about the crash, Mason?" Daniel asked carefully. "Anything at all?" Mason's face scrunched up as though the question pained him. I remember the car. It was going so fast," he said, his voice barely audible. "And I remember the noise. The sound of metal and glass. And screaming." Daniel's jaw tightened. A luxury car speeding through a suburban neighborhood didn't sit right with him. Accidents happened, but something about this didn't feel like an accident. He glanced at the photo again, noting the car's distinctive shape. It was a clue, a small one, but a clue nonetheless. "Thank you for telling me, Mason," Daniel said. "You've been very brave." Mason sniffled and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I didn't want to leave them," he said suddenly, "but they said I had to." Daniel frowned. "Who said you had to leave?" "The people at the hospital," Mason said. "They said there was no one left for me. They sent me to the home." The home. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He knew the local orphanage Mason was referring to, a dreary, underfunded facility on the edge of town. It had a reputation for being strict, but nothing worse than that. Still, something in Mason's tone set off alarm bells. "What happened at the home?" Daniel asked gently. Mason's face crumpled, and he buried it in his hands. "I don't want to go back there," he cried. "Please don't make me go back." Daniel's heart ached for the boy. He leaned across the table and rested a hand on Mason's shoulder. Hey, it's okay," he said soothingly. "No one is sending you back. You're staying here with me for now. All right. You're safe." Mason looked up at him, his eyes wide and pleading. "You promise?" "I promise," Daniel said firmly. The boy relaxed slightly, his grip on the table loosening. Daniel sat back, his mind racing. He couldn't ignore Mason's fear or the details of the story he was piecing together. Something about the crash and the orphanage didn't add up. After breakfast, Daniel called his captain, explaining the situation without going into too much detail. "I'm taking some personal time," he said. "I need to help a kid who's been through a lot." The captain agreed without hesitation, knowing Daniel's reputation for integrity and his soft spot for children. With Mason still hesitant to share much more, Daniel decided to focus on the photograph. He placed it carefully in an evidence bag, grabbed his laptop, and began researching luxury car models. The vehicle in the photo had a distinctive grille, and he was determined to find a match. Hours later, as Mason napped on the couch, Daniel found what he was looking for. The car in the photograph was a high-end European model, rare, expensive, and not something you'd typically find in their town. Daniel jotted down the details and cross-referenced them with local traffic reports. If this car had been involved in the crash, there had to be a record. His search led him to a report from 6 months earlier, a fatal accident involving a black luxury car. The crash had been ruled an accident caused by speeding, but the driver, a wealthy businesswoman named Evelyn Carver, had been cleared of charges due to lack of evidence. Daniel's blood boiled as he read the details. The report mentioned only 2 fatalities: Mason's parents. There was no mention of the boy himself. "Why didn't they list you in the report?" Daniel murmured to himself. Mason stirred on the couch, mumbling in his sleep. Daniel's jaw clenched. This wasn't just a case of negligence. Something more sinister was at play. Someone had deliberately erased Mason from the official record, leaving him alone and vulnerable. Daniel glanced at the boy, his small form curled up on the couch. He had a feeling Mason's story was just the beginning of a much larger truth, a truth someone had gone to great lengths to bury. But Daniel wasn't going to let that happen. He wasn't just a cop anymore. He was Mason's protector, and he was going to get to the bottom of this, no matter what it took. Daniel stared at the screen, his mind racing with questions. The accident report was thin, almost suspiciously so, and it didn't make sense for Mason to be missing from the list of victims or survivors. A child involved in a crash of this magnitude would have been mentioned, especially since he was now at an orphanage. The discrepancies in the report gnawed at him. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to Mason. The boy stirred slightly on the couch, clutching a blanket around him. The photograph was still within his grasp, even in sleep. Daniel felt a surge of protectiveness. Mason had been through hell, and someone was trying to make him disappear, both from the world and from the truth. Taking a deep breath, Daniel decided to follow up on the accident report directly. He picked up the phone and dialed a contact at the station. Detective Laura Hayes. Laura was sharp, tenacious, and unafraid to dig into messy cases. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it was her. Detective Hayes. Laura's voice came through, brisk but warm. "Laura, it's Daniel," he said, keeping his tone low so as not to wake Mason. "I've got a situation here, and I need your help." "Is this about one of your patrol cases?" she asked, her tone curious. "Not exactly. It's personal," Daniel admitted. "There's a boy staying with me right now. His parents died in a car crash about 6 months ago, but there are some serious inconsistencies in the accident report." Laura's voice became more serious. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "For starters, the report doesn't mention him at all," Daniel said, his frustration clear. "The crash killed both his parents. But there's no record of Mason, no indication that he was even there. He says he was taken to an orphanage afterward, but none of that is in the report either." "That's strange," Laura said. "A child would definitely be included in the documentation. Are you sure the report is complete?" "It's the official file, but it feels incomplete," Daniel replied. "I need you to pull up everything related to the crash. Witness statements, evidence, anything that wasn't included in the summary." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "All right, I'll see what I can find. What's the case number?" Daniel rattled off the details from the file. "And Laura, there's something else. The other driver was Evelyn Carver." Laura let out a low whistle. "Carver? As in the Carver family that owns half the real estate in the city?" "The same," Daniel said grimly. "She was driving a high-end luxury car that Mason remembers speeding toward them. The report says she was cleared, but it smells like a cover-up." "Got it," Laura said. "I'll dig into this and get back to you. In the meantime, keep that boy safe. If someone wanted him erased from the record, they might not stop there." Daniel's chest tightened at the thought, but he kept his voice steady. "I will. Thanks, Laura." After hanging up, he glanced back at Mason. The boy had shifted in his sleep, his face now visible beneath the blanket. Daniel couldn't help but notice the deep lines of worry etched into his young features. No child should have to carry that kind of weight. The creak of the couch startled him, and Mason blinked awake, rubbing his eyes groggily. He looked around, momentarily disoriented, before his gaze landed on Daniel. "Hey there," Daniel said gently. "Did you get some rest?" Mason nodded but didn't speak. His hand instinctively reached for the photograph. Holding it close once again, Daniel decided to tread carefully. "I've been looking into what happened to your family," Daniel said softly. "I want to help you figure out the truth, Mason. But I need to know more about what you remember. Anything could help." Mason hesitated, his small fingers running along the edge of the photograph. "I told you, we were going to the park. It was my birthday. Mom and Dad were laughing about something." His voice wavered, and his eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to take pictures of them. That's when I took this." Daniel nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Then, the car came out of nowhere," Mason said, his voice trembling. "It was going so fast. I remember Dad yelling and Mom screaming. And then everything went dark." Daniel's heart ached for the boy, but he pressed gently. "And after the crash, What happened next? Mason stared down at the photograph, his voice dropping to a whisper. I woke up in the hospital. They told me my parents were gone. And then they sent me to the home. Did anyone from the hospital talk to you about the crash? Did they ask you what happened? Mason shook his head. No. They just said I didn't have anyone left. They didn't care. Daniel's jaw tightened. The more Mason spoke, the clearer it became that someone had intentionally swept him under the rug. But why? What did they stand to gain by erasing a grieving child from the story? Before Daniel could ask another question, his phone buzzed. It was Laura. Daniel. I've got something, she said, her tone urgent. There's a supplemental report attached to the case, but it's not in the main file. It mentions a child survivor, but says the boy was in critical condition and unresponsive. The report was flagged for follow-up, but there's no record of that follow-up ever happening. Daniel frowned. So they knew about Mason, but they buried it. Looks that way, Laura said. And here's the kicker. Evelyn Carver's lawyer filed an appeal to have the crash details sealed shortly after the investigation closed. They cited privacy concerns, but my guess is they didn't want anyone digging too deep. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. And what about the orphanage? Is there any mention of Mason being sent there? Nothing, Laura said. If he was placed there, it wasn't through official channels. It's like someone wanted him out of sight and out of mind. Daniel's stomach churned. Thanks, Laura. Let me know if you find anything else. He hung up and turned to Mason, who was watching him with wide, wary eyes. Mason, Daniel said gently, I think someone didn't want people to know the truth about what happened to your family. But I promise you, I'm going to find out why. And I'll make sure you're safe. Mason looked down at the photograph again, his small hands trembling. I just want to know why they're gone, he whispered. Why did this happen to us? Daniel reached across the table and placed a reassuring hand on Mason's. We'll figure it out together, he said firmly. You're not alone anymore. For the first time, Mason looked up at him with a glimmer of hope. The photograph, once a symbol of everything he'd lost, now held the promise of answers. And Daniel wasn't going to stop until he found them. A trail of secrets. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting warm light across the living room, where Mason sat curled up on the couch. His small fingers still clutched the edges of the photograph as though it were a lifeline. Across the room, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the clatter of his laptop keys breaking the otherwise still air. The weight of what they had uncovered so far pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he was determined to see it through. Daniel had spent the last hour poring over the supplemental accident report Detective Hayes had uncovered. While the document confirmed Mason's presence at the crash scene, it offered little else. Just a vague note about his critical condition and a flagged follow-up that never happened. It was a glaring red flag, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that someone had gone to great lengths to make Mason disappear. His focus shifted to the name at the center of the report. Evelyn Carver. The Carver family was well known in their city for their wealth and influence. They owned several high-end properties, funded local charities, and had a reputation for being untouchable. If Evelyn had been involved in the crash, it wasn't hard to imagine her using her resources to cover her tracks. Daniel sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He glanced at Mason, who was now quietly flipping through one of the photo albums Daniel had left out for him. The boy's small shoulders were hunched, and his face was etched with an expression far too serious for his age. Daniel's heart ached for him, but there was no time to dwell on emotions now. He needed answers. Picking up his phone, Daniel called Laura again. She answered on the second ring. Hey Laura, he said, keeping his voice low. I've been digging into the Carver family, and I think Evelyn's involvement goes deeper than we thought. Is there any way to find out who handled the investigation? I already checked, Laura replied, her tone grim. The officer in charge of the case was Sergeant Mark Klein. He retired about 3 months ago, but his name is all over the original report. Daniel frowned. Klein? I know him. He's a straight shooter. Why would he let something like this slip through? That's what doesn't make sense, Laura said. His record is spotless. No signs of corruption, no complaints. But if he was pressured into closing the case quickly, there might be more to the story. Daniel's mind raced. Do you have his contact information? Sending it to you now, Laura said. Be careful, Daniel. If the Carvers are involved, this could get messy. Thanks, Laura. I owe you one. After hanging up, Daniel received the contact details for Klein and dialed the number. The retired sergeant answered after a few rings, his gruff voice familiar. Klein speaking. Mark, it's Daniel Rhodes, he began. I need to ask you about a case you handled before you retired. The Carver crash, 6 months ago. There was a pause on the other end. I remember it, Klein said carefully. Why? There are some serious inconsistencies in the report, Daniel said. The crash killed 2 people, but the child involved wasn't documented properly. I'm trying to piece together what happened, and I think someone might have tampered with the investigation. Klein let out a long sigh. I figured someone would come asking about that sooner or later, he said. Come by my place. We'll talk. Daniel agreed and hung up, turning his attention back to Mason. Hey, buddy, he said, crouching beside the couch. I need to step out for a little bit. Will you be okay here? Mrs. Brown from the diner said she'd come by to keep you company. Mason hesitated, his fingers tightening on the photograph. You're coming back, right? Of course, Daniel said firmly. I promise. Mason nodded reluctantly, and Daniel ruffled his hair before heading out. Klein's house was a modest, single-story home on the outskirts of town. The yard was well kept, and an American flag fluttered on the porch. Daniel parked his car in the driveway and knocked on the door. Klein answered, his tall frame filling the doorway. Though his hair was gray, his piercing blue eyes still carried the sharpness of a seasoned officer. Come in, Klein said, stepping aside. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, with family photos lining the walls. Klein gestured for Daniel to sit at the kitchen table before pouring them both a cup of coffee. So, what's this about the Carver crash? Klein asked, sitting down. Daniel pulled out the photograph Mason had entrusted to him and set it on the table. This boy, Mason, was in the crash that killed his parents, but the report doesn't mention him, and the follow-up was never done. I think someone wanted him erased from the narrative. Klein stared at the photograph, his expression hardening. I remember the crash, he said. It was bad. The scene was chaos, 2 fatalities, and a kid pulled from the wreckage. The boy was unconscious when we arrived, and the paramedics took him to the hospital. Why wasn't he in the report? Daniel pressed. Klein hesitated, his jaw tightening. I was told to leave him out, he said finally. Orders came down from above. Above. Daniel repeated, his anger rising. Who gave the order? Klein shook his head. The chief at the time. He said it was a sensitive case, that the Carver family wanted it handled quietly. They claimed the boy wasn't relevant to the investigation. Daniel slammed his fist on the table. Not relevant. He lost his family in that crash. I know, Klein said, his voice weary. But I wasn't in a position to argue. The Carvers have deep pockets and long reach. They made it clear there'd be consequences if anyone pushed back. Daniel sat back, seething. This isn't just negligence. It's a cover-up. Mason's been living in an orphanage, thinking he has no one, because someone decided his life didn't matter. Klein met his gaze, his expression troubled. I didn't agree with it then, and I don't now, he said. But there's nothing I can do about it anymore. I'm retired. Well, I'm not, Daniel said firmly. And I'm not letting this go. Klein nodded slowly. Be careful, Rhodes. The Carvers don't play fair. When Daniel returned home, Mrs. Brown was sitting on the couch with Mason, who was showing her the photo album he had been looking at earlier. She smiled warmly when she saw Daniel. He's been a good boy, she said. Barely made a peep. Thanks for watching him, Daniel said. I owe you. After Mrs. Brown left, Daniel sat down with Mason, who looked at him expectantly. "Did you find out anything?" the boy asked. "I did," Daniel said, "but it's going to take some time to figure everything out. I need you to trust me, Mason. Can you do that?" Mason nodded, his small face serious. "I trust you." Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Good. We're going to get to the bottom of this together." As night fell, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The weight of the Carver family's influence loomed over him, but his resolve was unshakable. Mason deserved answers and justice, and Daniel was determined to give him both, no matter the cost. Shadows of the Carver legacy. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the city streets as Daniel Rhodes sat at his desk, the glow of his laptop illuminating his furrowed brow. The deeper he dug into the Carver family, the more questions piled up. Evelyn Carver's name appeared in connection with several local charities, high-profile events, and lucrative business deals. Yet every detail about her life seemed meticulously curated, leaving no room for flaws or controversy. What troubled him most was the sealed court filing Laura had mentioned. Daniel had seen cases like this before, where the wealthy used their influence to bury inconvenient truths. But this wasn't just about privilege or power. It was about a little boy who had been stripped of his family and left to fend for himself in a system that had failed him. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. Mason was upstairs in the guest room, tucked into bed after an evening of grilled cheese sandwiches and a movie. The boy had finally begun to relax in Daniel's presence, though the photograph still rarely left his side. That small, worn piece of paper seemed to be his anchor to a world he was still trying to understand. A sharp knock at the door broke Daniel's train of thought. His hand instinctively went to the sidearm on his belt as he approached. Through the peephole, he saw a woman standing on the porch, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the streetlight. She was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blazer and matching skirt, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. Daniel opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" The woman's smile was professional but cold. "Officer Rhodes, I presume," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. "My name is Victoria Hale. I'm an attorney representing the Carver family." Daniel's grip on the door tightened. "And what brings you here, Miss Hale?" Victoria held up a leather-bound folder. "I believe you've been looking into an incident involving my client, Ms. Evelyn Carver. I'm here to advise you to cease any further inquiries. This is a delicate matter, and we'd prefer to handle it privately." Daniel crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "Privately? A boy lost his parents in that crash. He's been living in an orphanage, forgotten by the system, while your client walks free. I don't think there's anything private about that." Victoria's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened. "Officer Rhodes, I'm here as a courtesy. The Carver family has nothing to hide, but they value their privacy. Continuing to investigate this matter could lead to unnecessary complications for you and for the boy." The veiled threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. Daniel took a step closer, his voice low and steady. "Let me make something clear, Ms. Hale. I don't care how wealthy or powerful your client is. Mason deserves answers, and I'm going to find them. You can tell the Carvers that their money won't buy them out of this." Victoria's smile finally faltered. She stepped back, her tone icy. "You've been warned, Officer Rhodes. I suggest you think carefully about your next steps." Without another word, she turned and walked back to the sleek black sedan idling at the curb. Daniel watched as the car disappeared into the night, his fists clenched at his sides. The Carvers were rattled, enough to send a lawyer to his doorstep. That meant he was on the right track. The next morning, Daniel woke early, the events of the previous night still weighing heavily on his mind. He decided it was time to pay a visit to the orphanage where Mason had been sent. The boy had spoken little about his time there, but what he had shared painted a bleak picture. If there were any records or staff who could shed light on Mason's story, Daniel needed to find them. The Riverside Children's Home was as dreary as Daniel had expected. The building was an aging brick structure with boarded-up windows and a chain-link fence surrounding the property. The lawn was overgrown, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Daniel stepped inside, his badge prominently displayed. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Mrs. Platt, looked up from her desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone wary. "I'm Officer Daniel Rhodes," he said, his voice firm but polite. "I'm here about a former resident, Mason Reed. He was placed here about 6 months ago after a car accident." Mrs. Platt's expression darkened. "Mason," she repeated. "Poor boy. He didn't stay long." Daniel leaned forward. "What can you tell me about his time here?" Mrs. Platt hesitated, glancing around as though checking for eavesdroppers. "Mason was a sweet kid," she said finally. "Quiet, kept to himself. But he had a hard time here." Mrs. Henderson, the director, didn't take to him. "Why not?" Daniel asked, his jaw tightening. "She said he was troubled," Mrs. Platt said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But he wasn't. He was just grieving. She treated him worse than the others, made him stay in his room most of the time. He left one night, and we never saw him again." Daniel's stomach churned. "Is Mrs. Henderson here?" Mrs. Platt shook her head. "She retired last month. I don't know where she went." "Do you have any records on Mason?" Daniel asked. "Anything that might help me understand why he was treated this way?" Mrs. Platt hesitated again, then nodded. "Follow me." She led Daniel to a small storage room filled with filing cabinets. She rifled through one of them, pulling out a thin folder labeled Reed Mason. She handed it to Daniel, her expression apologetic. "I wish I could tell you more," she said, "but you should know. Mrs. Henderson kept a lot of things off the books. If you're looking for the truth, it might not be in there." Daniel thanked her and left, the folder clutched tightly in his hand. He sat in his car and opened it, flipping through the sparse documents. The file contained Mason's basic information, a brief medical report from his time at the hospital, and a single note from Mrs. Henderson. "Child displays signs of emotional instability. Recommend limited interaction with other residents." Daniel's hands shook with anger as he read the note. This wasn't an evaluation. It was an excuse. Mrs. Henderson had isolated Mason, compounding his trauma, and no one had intervened. He closed the folder, his resolve hardening. As he started the car, his phone buzzed with a message from Laura. "Found something. Evelyn Carver's sealed file includes a payout to an unnamed recipient. Large sum, right after the accident. Call me." Daniel's heart raced. The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they painted was one of corruption, cruelty, and cover-ups. He glanced back at the orphanage, its dreary facade a testament to the failures of the system. Mason had been failed at every turn, but Daniel wouldn't let it happen again. He would uncover the truth, no matter how deep he had to dig, and no matter how dangerous it became. Daniel dialed Laura as he pulled away from the orphanage. His mind churned with thoughts about the payout she'd mentioned. If someone had been paid off, it could explain the gaps in Mason's story and the lack of justice for his family. "Laura," he said as soon as she picked up, "what did you find?" "I dug deeper into the sealed records," Laura said, her tone brisk. "There's a payment listed under Evelyn Carver's financial activity, an untraceable sum transferred to an anonymous account a few weeks after the crash. It's enough to suggest a settlement, likely to keep someone quiet." "Who was the recipient?" Daniel asked, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "I don't have a name," Laura admitted, "but the payment coincides with the timing of a resignation from the hospital where Mason was treated, a Dr. Harold Lynn. He left abruptly, and there's no indication he's practicing medicine anywhere else." Daniel's gut clenched. "Do you have anything on this Dr. Lynn? An address, a contact number?" "I tracked down an old address for him," Laura said. "Sending it to you now. Be careful, Daniel. This is starting to feel bigger than just a cover-up." "Thanks, Laura." Daniel said before hanging up. Moments later, his phone buzzed with a notification containing Lynn's last known address. The drive to Harold Lynn's former residence took Daniel to the outskirts of the city, where modest homes sat on large, overgrown lots. The house at the address was a small, weathered bungalow with peeling paint and a rusted mailbox. It looked abandoned, but Daniel wasn't one to trust appearances. He parked on the curb and approached the front door, noting the quiet stillness around him. After knocking and waiting a few moments with no response, he tried the door. It was unlocked. Cautiously, he stepped inside, his hand hovering near his holstered firearm. The interior was sparsely furnished and eerily silent. Dust coated the surfaces, and the air smelled of mildew and neglect. It was clear no one had lived here for some time, but Daniel's trained eye caught signs that someone had been here recently. A half-empty coffee mug on the kitchen counter, a newspaper dated only a week earlier. He moved through the house, checking each room until he reached a small study at the back. The desk was cluttered with papers, and a laptop sat open but powered off. Daniel flipped through the documents, finding medical forms, patient records, and scribbled notes in a hurried hand. One sheet stood out, a handwritten letter that seemed to have been abandoned mid-draft. To whom it may concern, I cannot keep silent about what happened that night. I was pressured to falsify records, to omit details about the boy, Mason Reed. He survived, but they wanted his name removed. I suspect it was Evelyn Carver's doing, though I have no proof. The letter ended abruptly, the pen's ink trailing off the page. Daniel's pulse quickened. Dr. Lynn had clearly known about the cover-up and had tried to document it, but why had he stopped? And where was he now? As Daniel scanned the desk for more clues, a noise from outside caught his attention, a car door slamming. He froze, straining to hear more. Footsteps approached the house, deliberate and heavy. Daniel moved quickly, shutting off the desk lamp and stepping into the shadows of the study. His hand went to his firearm as he listened. The front door creaked open, and two voices floated through the house. "Check the study," one man said, his tone cold and authoritative. "Make sure we get everything." Daniel's heart pounded. Whoever they weren't here by coincidence. These men were cleaning up loose ends, and if they found him, it wouldn't end well. He moved silently, positioning himself behind the door of the study. The sound of boots on the hardwood floor grew louder until a figure stepped into the room. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in black, with a gun holstered at his side. He began rifling through the papers on the desk, oblivious to Daniel's presence. In one swift motion, Daniel stepped forward and pressed his own gun to the man's back. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice low but firm. The man froze, his hands raised slightly. "Who the hell are you?" he growled. "I could ask you the same thing," Daniel retorted, "but I'm guessing you're not here to read medical journals." The man didn't respond, his muscles tense. Daniel heard the second intruder approaching and knew he had only seconds to act. He struck the man's temple with the butt of his gun, knocking him out cold, and moved to the edge of the doorway. The second man entered the study, his gun drawn, but Daniel was ready. He lunged, disarming the intruder with practiced efficiency and pinning him against the wall. "Who sent you?" Daniel demanded, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," the man spat, struggling against Daniel's grip. Daniel applied more pressure, his voice deadly calm. "Let me guess, Evelyn Carver. Did she send you to destroy evidence, or was it someone else in her circle?" The man's eyes flickered with recognition at Evelyn's name, confirming Daniel's suspicions. Before Daniel could press further, the man twisted violently, breaking free and shoving Daniel backward. He bolted toward the front door, leaving his unconscious partner behind. Daniel didn't follow. Instead, he quickly gathered the documents from the desk, including the unfinished letter, and slipped out the back door. He couldn't risk staying any longer. Back at his house, Daniel locked the door and drew the curtains, his mind racing. Mason was still asleep upstairs, unaware of the danger closing in around them. Daniel spread the documents across the dining table, carefully examining each one. Most were patient records, irrelevant to Mason's case, but the letter confirmed his suspicions. The cover-up wasn't just a family protecting their reputation. It was deliberate, calculated, and far-reaching. Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "Any luck with Lynn?" He replied. "He's gone, but I found evidence he was pressured to falsify Mason's records. I'll explain more tomorrow." The Carver family's influence extended further than Daniel had anticipated, but he wasn't backing down. He looked up at the stairs, where Mason's quiet breathing was a reminder of why this fight mattered. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't just investigating a case, he was protecting a child who had been betrayed at every turn. And no matter what the Carvers threw at him, he wouldn't stop until Mason had justice. With renewed determination, Daniel began planning his next move. It was time to confront Evelyn Carver directly, even if it meant putting himself in the crosshairs. Into the lion's den. The night stretched on in tense silence. Daniel couldn't shake the image of the two men rifling through Dr. Lynn's study. It was a clear warning. The Carver family, or someone working in their interest, was actively erasing evidence. If he didn't act quickly, the truth might vanish completely. He sat at his dining table, the dim overhead light casting long shadows on the stack of papers he'd retrieved. Mason was still asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the danger they faced. Daniel thumbed through the documents, his eyes landing once again on the unfinished letter. "I cannot keep silent about what happened that night." Dr. Lynn had been ready to expose everything, but had been silenced before he could. Whether he'd gone into hiding or met a worse fate, Daniel didn't know, but the letter was damning enough to warrant action. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Daniel made a decision. It was time to confront Evelyn Carver directly. No more shadows, no more secrets. If she wanted to silence him, she'd have to do it to his face. Daniel spent the morning preparing. He ensured Mason had everything he needed to stay safe, locking the house down as a precaution. He called Mrs. Brown, the kind waitress from the diner, and asked her to come over and watch Mason. "I just need a few hours," he told her. "Keep an eye on him, and don't answer the door for anyone but me." Mrs. Brown didn't ask questions, her motherly instincts kicking in. "Of course, Daniel. That little boy's been through enough. I'll keep him safe." With Mason secured, Daniel donned his uniform, clipped his badge to his belt, and slid his sidearm into its holster. This wasn't just a conversation. He was walking into enemy territory, and he needed to be ready for anything. The Carver estate was as ostentatious as Daniel expected. A sprawling mansion sat behind high iron gates, the driveway lined with meticulously pruned hedges. The sheer wealth on display was enough to make Daniel's stomach turn. He buzzed the intercom at the gate, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "This is Officer Daniel Rhodes. I'm here to speak with Evelyn Carver." There was a pause before a crisp female voice replied. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Daniel said bluntly. "But I have questions about a boy named Mason Reed and the crash that killed his parents. If Evelyn doesn't want to talk to me, I'm happy to take this to the press instead." The line went silent for several seconds before the gates creaked open. Daniel drove through, parking in the circular driveway. A butler met him at the front door, his expression neutral but tense. "This way," the man said, leading Daniel into a grand foyer. The marble floors gleamed under an enormous chandelier, and expensive artwork adorned the walls. The opulence was suffocating. Evelyn Carver waited in a sunlit sitting room, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. She was every bit as polished as her reputation, her blonde hair impeccably styled, her makeup flawless. She looked up as Daniel entered, her expression cool and unreadable. "Officer Rhodes," she said smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Daniel didn't smile. He met her gaze head-on, his voice firm. "I'm here about Mason Reed." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "The name doesn't ring a bell." "Don't play games with me, Miss Carver," Daniel said, his tone sharp. "He's the boy who survived the crash your car caused 6 months ago. The same crash that killed his parents." Evelyn's composure faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered. "Ah, that tragedy. A terrible accident," she said, her voice dripping with practiced sympathy. "I've already answered questions about it. The matter was resolved months ago." "Resolved," Daniel repeated, his anger bubbling to the surface. "You mean covered up?" Mason's name was erased from the report, his existence buried. "And now your goons are destroying evidence that could prove what really happened." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her mask of politeness slipping. "I don't know what you're insinuating, officer, but I assure you, my family had nothing to do with any so-called cover-up." Daniel stepped closer, his voice low but deadly. "Then explain the payout. A large sum, transferred to an anonymous account, right after the crash. Who were you paying off, Evelyn?" "Dr. Harold Lynn, the hospital, the police chief." Evelyn set her teacup down, her movements deliberate. "You're walking a dangerous line, officer. I suggest you tread carefully." "You don't scare me," Daniel said, his gaze unwavering. "You're going to tell me the truth, or I'll make sure everyone in this city knows exactly what kind of person you are." For the first time, Evelyn's composure cracked. Her eyes flashed with something dark, fear, anger, or perhaps both. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said. "My family has built this city. We've helped more people than you could imagine. That boy's parents, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was an accident, nothing more." "An accident?" Daniel shot back. "You were speeding through a residential neighborhood in a car worth more than most people's homes. You killed 2 innocent people and left their son to rot in an orphanage. That's not an accident. That's negligence." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Daniel pressed on. "Mason deserves better than this. He deserves justice for what happened to his family. And I'm going to make sure he gets it, whether you cooperate or not." Evelyn stood, her towering presence meant to intimidate. "Get out of my house, officer. This conversation is over." Daniel didn't move. "I'll leave," he said, his voice steady. "But this isn't over. You've spent 6 months hiding from the truth, but it's catching up to you." He turned and walked out, his steps echoing through the grand foyer. The butler opened the door for him, his expression unreadable, and Daniel stepped into the crisp morning air. Back in his car, Daniel took a deep breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The confrontation had been tense, but it had confirmed what he already knew. Evelyn Carver was guilty, and she was scared. He couldn't stop now. As he drove back home, his phone buzzed with a text from Laura. "I got something else. Dr. Lynn's credit card was used at a motel 2 towns over. Sending you the address." Daniel's pulse quickened. If Dr. Lynn was alive, he might hold the key to unraveling the entire cover-up. But he'd have to act fast. The Carver family was clearly willing to go to great lengths to protect their secrets, and time was running out. He glanced at the photograph of Mason's family sitting in the passenger seat, its edges frayed but its meaning unyielding. The boy's life had been torn apart by greed and carelessness, but Daniel wasn't giving up. Not until Mason had the answers and the justice he deserved. The truth unveiled. The motel was a dingy, nondescript building on the edge of a small industrial town. Its faded neon sign flickered against the overcast sky, casting an eerie glow over the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. Daniel parked his car near the office and double-checked the address Laura had sent him. Room 214. That was where Dr. Harold Lynn had used his credit card. If the man was here, he could be the missing piece in unraveling the Carver family's stranglehold on the truth. Daniel stepped out of his car, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the stairs leading to the second floor. His hand rested on his holstered sidearm, ready for whatever awaited him. The motel was quiet, save for the faint hum of a vending machine nearby. As he reached room 214, he knocked firmly. "Dr. Lin," he called out. "This is Officer Daniel Rhodes. I need to speak with you." For a moment, there was no response. Daniel was about to knock again when the door creaked open slightly, revealing a man in his late 50s. His face was pale and gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous twitch to his movements. He peered at Daniel through the crack, his expression wary. "Who are you?" Lin asked, his voice shaky. "I told you, Officer Daniel Rhodes," Daniel said, keeping his tone calm but firm. "I'm here about Mason Reed and the car crash 6 months ago." At the mention of Mason's name, Lin's eyes widened, and he opened the door fully. "Come in," he said, glancing nervously down the walkway before ushering Daniel inside. The room was small and sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a small table, and a chair. Papers were scattered across the table, along with a laptop and an empty coffee cup. Lin closed the door behind them, locking it with trembling hands. "You shouldn't be here," Lin said, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they find out I talked to you." "They won't," Daniel interrupted. "But I need the truth, Dr. Lin. Mason deserves that much. Tell me what happened." Lin sank into the chair, his hands trembling as he picked up a piece of paper and stared at it blankly. "I should have come forward months ago," he muttered. "But they threatened me. Said they'd ruin me, my family." "Who threatened you?" Daniel asked, his tone sharp. "Evelyn Carver." Lin nodded slowly. "Her lawyers. Her people. After the crash, they paid me to falsify Mason's records, to say he was unresponsive and had no living relatives. They didn't want any attention on the boy." "Why?" Daniel pressed. "What could they gain by erasing Mason?" Lin's face contorted with guilt. "The crash was Evelyn's fault," he said. "She was speeding, intoxicated. If the case had gone to court, Mason's testimony could have destroyed her. They couldn't risk that." Daniel's jaw tightened. "So they buried him in an orphanage and silenced everyone who knew the truth." Lin nodded again, his voice breaking. "I tried to document what they made me do. I wanted to come clean, but when I started writing the letter, men showed up at my house. They warned me to stop. I left everything behind. My practice, my home. I've been hiding ever since." Daniel clenched his fists, the anger boiling in his chest. "Do you have proof? Anything that ties Evelyn to the cover-up?" Lin gestured to the scattered papers on the table. "Copies of the falsified records, payment receipts, emails. It's all there." Daniel quickly scanned the documents, his heart pounding as he realized the magnitude of the evidence. Everything Lin had said was corroborated. Evelyn's lawyers had orchestrated the falsification, and the payout had been carefully disguised through multiple shell accounts. This was the smoking gun. "You did the right thing coming forward," Daniel said, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "But you're not safe here. They'll come after you again." Lin looked up at him, fear etched into his features. "What do I do?" "I'll get you protection," Daniel said firmly. "But first, we need to take this evidence to the DA. It's time to put an end to this." The drive back to the city was tense. Lin sat in the passenger seat, clutching a folder filled with the incriminating documents. Daniel's phone buzzed repeatedly with calls and messages from Laura, who had pieced together more connections between Evelyn Carver's wealth and the police department's former leadership. The corruption ran deeper than Daniel had imagined. They arrived at the district attorney's office just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the imposing courthouse. Laura met them at the entrance, her expression a mix of determination and urgency. "Is this him?" she asked, nodding toward Lin. Daniel nodded. "He's got everything we need." They hurried inside, presenting the evidence to the DA, a sharp-eyed woman named Elena Vargas. As she reviewed the documents, Her expression shifted from curiosity to outrage. "This is damning," Vargas said, slamming the folder shut. "We can move on this immediately. Arrest warrants, subpoenas, the whole 9 yards." "Start with Evelyn Carver," Daniel said. "She's the one pulling the strings." Vargas nodded. "I'll get the ball rolling, but you need to keep an eye on that boy, Mason. If the Carvers realize the truth is coming out, they might target him." "I won't let that happen," Daniel said firmly. That night, Daniel returned home, exhausted but relieved. Mason was waiting for him on the couch, his small face lighting up as Daniel walked in. Mrs. Brown gave Daniel a knowing smile before leaving them alone. "Did you find him?" Mason asked eagerly. Daniel sat beside the boy, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I did, Mason, and he told me everything. We're going to make sure the people who hurt your family are held accountable." Mason's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of hope. "Thank you," he whispered, clutching Daniel's hand. Daniel pulled the boy into a gentle hug, his resolve stronger than ever. He had uncovered the truth, but the fight wasn't over. He knew the Carvers wouldn't go down without a fight. But for Mason, and for the justice his family deserved, Daniel was ready for whatever came next.